Welcome to Stop Being a Fossil Fool. I'm one of your hosts, Temi, along with my co-hosts Christy and Eric. We're going to start today's podcast by giving you a brief introduction into our research on the world of greenhouse gas emissions from industrial agriculture. Then, we will be joined by a special guest star who has real-world experience in this field. Finally, we're going to wrap up by explaining some of our findings we've discovered during our research process. In 2016, a new geological epoch was declared. We are now living in the Anthropocene. This new epoch has been defined by researchers as a process where humans have an equal impact on the planet as natural processes do. The agriculture industry has grown out of control with their inefficient use of fossil fuels due to a lack of government regulation and law enforcement. In order to gauge how much damage the agriculture industry is doing to the environment, our group has decided to do a little more research on how greenhouse gases and agriculture are connected. Specifically, we decided to look at nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and methane to find out which of these gases' emissions from the agricultural sector is most likely to have the largest negative impact and which can be most easily mitigated. According to the EPA, in 2018, these three gases made up nearly 98% of all greenhouse gas emissions. As we looked closer into the agriculture industry's emissions, we were surprised by many of our findings. While CO2 makes up the majority of total global greenhouse gas emissions each year, this trend does not hold true when talking specifically about the agricultural sector. In 2018, U.S. agriculture emitted an estimated 698 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. 12.3% of this was carbon dioxide, 36.2% of this was methane, and 51.4% of this was nitrous oxide. Part of our research included reaching out to experts we know who could help lead us in the right direction, while also giving us information from their personal experiences. One of these experts is Arnold. We will be speaking with him today about his experiences as co-chair of the Sierra Club Grassroots Network Food and Agriculture Team. The team stands to promote agricultural policies and practices, like those of regenerative agriculture, in order to provide healthy, nutritious food and other services for all communities while maintaining the health of the soil and mitigating the agricultural industry's impact on climate change. The team is comprised of active, engaged volunteer activists from across the country who are interested in sustainable agriculture and nutritious food. Carl and his co-chair, Paul McCullough, both work to familiarize the general public with the principles and recommendations adopted in the Sierra Club Agriculture and Food Policy. The Food and Agriculture team works to promote farming methods that preserve cultural and biological diversity while benefiting local communities and improving rural livelihoods. The team lobbies for and supports food policies and practices that promote the regenerative organic transition away from the industrial chemical system of corporate farming. Currently, Carl is working with the team to build a legislative digest to assist different groups across the country in petitioning for state or local government support of the transition towards regenerative agricultural practices. Now, I'm going to hand it off to Christy, who will be leading the interview with Carl.
So, Carl, before we discuss the industrial chemical agricultural industry in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, could you take us through how the industry has transformed farming into what it is today? Also, how has the industrial agricultural system transformed the American landscape?
As early as the 1940s, I'm referring to Aldo Leopold and San County Almanac. He talks about erosion and soil depletion. This is around 1947, 48, 49, I believe, because of industrial agriculture, industrial chemical agriculture. And it was really getting going then because of the discoveries and developments during World War II. And of course, the companies that developed those substances, whether they were explosives or gases or what have you, wanted to get more out of their investment. And so they found ways. So the Dust Bowl was not just a meteorological anomaly. It was contributed to by human activity. And of course, that gave us grapes of wrath and the Great Migration West, as farmers were dispossessed from their land. And so it went, and since the 40s, it's just continued. So that I read a long time ago some commentary by American Farmland Trust that periodically, starting before World War I, I guess the federal authorities, and maybe state authorities too, tested topsoil in the Great Plains, the breadbasket. And because this is all less from the glaciers, or 4 main glaciations and probably several sub ones, the Great Plains had an average in around 1910 of 15 feet of topsoil, as I recall from this report. And periodically, every bunch of years, they would do another test and another test in various places. And by the late 70s, the topsoil was down to 4 feet. And that's because, obviously, of human agricultural practices. So that the loss of the buffalo herds and the native grasses in too much of the Great Plains, the rise of monocultures, the rise of chemical agriculture, all contributed to increased erosion from flooding, increased erosion from wind, because keep in mind that family farms have their paddocks and their fields and their hedgerows, and that reduces the effect of wind. It allows habitat for all sorts of animals, and those hedgerows tended to disappear with the larger and larger fields, with the larger and larger machinery to take care of the larger and larger acreage as farming became tended toward being industrialized. So what are there, 5 main crops now? Wheat, rice, corn, soy. And so the healthy soil has been depleted by lack of biodiversity and by the sapping of nutrients by all of these chemicals.
Can you tell us more about the industrial chemical agricultural industry in relation to climate change?
The bigger and bigger machines have bigger and bigger exhausts. So when you see those huge combines that, you see a row of, a dozen or 15 of them on hundreds of acres going in a staggered line, harvesting corn, say, or wheat, or the huge tractors with double rear wheels and double front wheels. Just think of the exhaust that puts CO2 and I believe nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and other toxins into the atmosphere. And that's in addition to the trucks and the diesel trains and the coal-fired power plants and everything else that we're doing, that humans are doing to contaminate the air we breathe.
And so what would happen if industrial chemical agriculture were to expand? What would be the tipping point?
If it expands, then all of the toxins and I'll just say toxins that go up into the atmosphere will continue in larger amounts. But what's also happening is that as the climate is warming, the pattern is clear, so that in Central America, over the coming 2 or 3 decades, the migration north will become far more extreme than it is now, because a large part of the reason so many in the last few years have come north is because they can't grow food anymore because of drought. Death squads is another reason for those who live in urban areas, but in the rural areas, their farming is being compromised, and that's only going to get worse. And the same thing is going to happen in the United States. I was just looking at a map the other day that shows what is likely to happen in 2070 or by 2070, where much of the South, from Texas all the way to the Carolinas, will no longer be viable for growing food. Well, what's going to happen to the population of the United States in general? What's going to happen in those areas that I just described if people can't make a living or farmers can't grow? About 8 years ago, I saw an analysis by a group of scientists in California that said, with present patterns holding, and in fact, those patterns are just getting worse every year, the northern Mexico and the southwestern United States could anticipate very shortly a 50-year drought. Whether that will happen, it's still theoretical, but we've already had a 5-year drought in California and a 2-year drought in Texas, which had enormous ramifications, of course, for the entire country, not just those states. Keep in mind that California provides approximately 1/3 of the produce for the entire US.
So, just to clarify then, industrial chemical agriculture is not sustainable.
Several years ago, I read a number of different articles on the two main feedstocks of chemical fertilizer, phosphorus and nitrogen. And the main supplies of those raw materials in the world, like bird and bat guano from Peru and a number of other sources around the world, are finite. You can't extract forever and expect the supply to be there forever. So they're disappearing. And the Novartises and Cargills and DuPonts and Monsantos, Bayer, those corporations in the world may be forced by lack of feedstock, of the basic phosphorus and nitrogen feedstocks, to alter how they do business. But the other tipping points, well, the federal government in general, for decades now, has encouraged factory farming to the detriment of medium and small farms, and has hampered the competitiveness of organic. Because the big corporations have the deep pockets and they buy enough politicians, and you may recall Sonny Perdue, the present Secretary of Agriculture, said notably a few months ago, either get big or get out. And that's still the present attitude.
Since regenerative organic agriculture is your primary area of focus, can you tell us how it works?
The still relatively small but growing movement for regenerative organic agriculture will soon reach critical mass. It's not on the horizon, but it's growing. More and more people are talking about it. Even General Mills, in its own superficial way, is supporting it. And other corporations are probably taking notice. But regenerative organic agriculture has been proven in different regions with different soils and different individual farmers. Regenerative organic ag has shown to be successful. It's not a set of rules, it's an approach. You don't disturb the top few inches of topsoil, which itself is an extraordinarily complex ecosystem, which includes microbes and fungi and little bugs and earthworms and little rodents, and of course the roots of plants, all of which work together and communicate with each other in rather incredible ways to make healthy soil. And depleted soil can be rebuilt, can be revived. And that's been shown, as I said, in a bunch of different regions of the United States. I think Hawaii also. I myself have seen an example of it at Soulfire Farm in Troy, New York, east of Albany. It used to be that these big industrial farmers, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 acres, would leave fields bare over the winter. That allows the CO2 and nitrogen to go up and the soil to be compromised. So you plant cover crops, and you can plant one, which is okay. It's better than nothing. Some people plant rye. But what is even better is to plant 8 or 10 or 12 different ones. So they mature at different times, they have different characteristics, they contribute to biodiversity. Nature is diverse, and when nature is healthy, it is diverse. When the opposite happens and you have a monoculture, then you're much more prone to disease and blight. Cover crops go a long way to assisting the farmer in rebuilding the soil, protecting the soil. And all of those plants, don't forget, even if they're just cover crops, while they were green, they absorbed carbon dioxide and put them down into the roots. The main thing that people tend to consider with rebuilding healthy soil, besides growing healthy plants and animals, including human animals, is the potential for drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere. And in 5th and 6th grade, that's what we learned was photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is breathed in by leaves, and oxygen is breathed out, transpiration. Well, what does the plant do with that carbon dioxide? Breaks it down, it goes down into the roots, it feeds the fungi, who trade minerals for it into the plant. And that's a very simple way of describing what goes on. It's a little more complex, but that's the basic idea. On one farm in North Dakota with only a 5-month growing season, Gabe Brown's, he not only built his formerly industrial chemical depleted soil. In some fields, he has now 28 inches of topsoil. And he has measured the carbon sequestration and while rebuilding the soil. So until he gets to a saturation point of, I think it's approximately 7% carbon content in any acre, he was sequestering 20 tons of carbon per acre per year.
So regenerative organic agriculture is potentially a solution for carbon dioxide mitigation?
Agriculture, with its relatively low-tech practices, has the sufficiently understood and extraordinarily promising potential to make a very serious dent in the carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere and warming the earth and causing climate chaos. And keep in mind that the very conservative United Nations in October of 2018 said that humanity has 12 years to get its act together to stem global warming and hopefully reduce it. If not, by around 2030, what we're looking at, and this is their phrase, what we're looking at is, quote, irreversible catastrophe, unquote. That's the conservative United Nations. Well, who made that report? Hundreds of scientists from 140 countries around the world. So that's an average opinion. So suppose the 2030 date, of course it's not fixed. No one can know for sure. But suppose they're off by a couple of years either way, or even a little bit more. It gives a stark picture of what we're looking at in the next few years. So people need to be alarmed, never panicked, but alarmed so that they get stimulated into doing something. And it's not putting in light bulbs and not using plastic straws, not good enough. We have to pressure our legislators, pressure the corporations, and when there's enough, things do change, and they already have been changing, but more and more is needed.
My fellow co-hosts and I would like to thank Mr. Arnold for taking the time to come and speak with us today. We are grateful for his extensive knowledge on the U.S. agricultural system, and his insight on regenerative organic agriculture will undoubtedly be essential in the fight against climate change. We thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us, and we wish you all the best in your future endeavors. After careful consideration of the information supplied by Mr. Arnold, as well as the data we compiled for carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, using the metrics of climate change impact potential, or CCIP, radiative forcing, global warming potential, lifetime in the atmosphere, and predictions for future potential emissions, as well as the viability and effectiveness of possible mitigation strategies, these are our findings. For carbon dioxide, the radiative forcing is 1.94, lifetime in the atmosphere is 300 to 1,000 years, the global warming potential is 1, and the feasibility of mitigation is easy. For nitrous oxide, the radiative forcing is 0.2, the lifetime in the atmosphere is 100 years, global warming potential ranges from 265 to 298, and the feasibility of mitigation ranges from easy to medium depending on the mitigation strategy. For methane, the radiative forcing is 0.5, the lifetime in the atmosphere is 10 years, global warming potential ranges from 28 to 36, and the feasibility of mitigation is very hard. To make a final decision on which greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are the most impactful, we decided that we needed a way to combine all of the data into one all-encompassing value. After conducting some research, my colleagues and I discovered the Climate Change Impact Potential Metric, or CCIP, which uses most of the data previously discussed to create a calculation that accurately represents total impacts related directly to potential for temperature increase, impacts related to the speed of warming, and impacts related to cumulative warming over time. Nitrous oxide is at the top of the list in two of the metric categories mentioned earlier. It has the highest CCIP value by a large margin and accounts for over 50% of all U.S. agriculture GHG emissions. Additionally, nitrous oxide emissions are predicted to continue to grow at an increasing rate as climate warms, because warmer temperatures will cause agricultural soils to release more nitrous oxide. One thing that my colleagues and I stressed in our research is the feasibility of mitigating each greenhouse gas. Essentially, even if it is clear which greenhouse gas is the most important to target, it doesn't matter if current mitigation strategies are not feasible to implement given the current political climate. Therefore, our choice on which greenhouse gas emissions was strongly affected by the practicality of its solution. While the mitigation strategies for carbon dioxide are relatively easy to implement, what we found is that the mitigation methods for agricultural carbon dioxide emissions are often a consequence of mitigating either methane or nitrous oxide emissions. For example, the use of cover cropping would reduce synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use. lowering nitrous oxide emissions, and also reduce the need for pesticides and herbicides, which will consequently lower the amount of fossil fuels being burned by the heavy machinery used to spray fields. When comparing the practicality and effectiveness of mitigation strategies for methane and nitrous oxide emissions, it becomes clear that nitrous oxide is the better choice. One of the major solutions for agricultural methane emissions is transitioning to the use of different cattle feed, which, although sounds easy enough, may be too expensive for most commercial farmers and ranchers. A switch to a new cattle feed will slow the growth rate of cattle production, which industrial livestock growers will refuse to do regardless if it reduces methane emissions. Most likely, beef production costs would rise, causing an equal increase in price on the consumer end. Additionally, this increase in cost may cause the suppliers to lose a large portion of their demand, which will either force them out of business or put the farmers into serious debt when they attempt to remodel their farms to supply the new cattle feed. Many solutions for reducing agricultural nitrous oxide emissions are much easier to implement, improving when and how fertilizer is applied depending on the crop, using no-till practices, using cover crops, and reducing the amount of fertilizer are all ways the nitrous oxide emissions can be cut down while not creating economic losses. Additionally, nitrous oxide emissions from food waste can be cut down if there was less production of food waste in this country. This would be achieved via new policy that would amend the use of costly and often inaccurate expiration dates and overhaul the throwing out of crops if they don't meet the aesthetic standards. Additionally, while the regenerative organic approach to agriculture is more sustainable, it's more important to understand that a sudden switch to a new model for the purpose of reducing GHG emissions is impossible due to many different factors, such as initial cost to farmers, the threat of food shortages during the switch, potential for economic losses due to eliminating the current agricultural system, which would be a big hit to our economy. The realistic approach is to make slow, steady policy changes that will support farmers to transition away from industrial chemical practices and move toward regenerative organic practices via the use of subsidies, lending programs, and reduced land rents. This transition will allow for the U.S. agricultural industry to become less of a polluter of nitrous oxide emissions and instead a leader of sustainable agriculture. Thank you so much for tuning in today to hear about our research on greenhouse gas emissions from industrial agriculture, and another big thank you to Mr. Carl Arnold. Check out our website for new blog posts related to this podcast and be sure to follow our research. And as always, don't be a fossil fool.